Hey, Ben, it's Aaron.
Hey, Aaron, it's Ben.
So, Ben, how long have you been following NASCAR?
A lifetime.
Well, I've been following it a lifetime too, so how fitting that we would start with episode 1 of the brand new A Lifetime in NASCAR podcast. I'd like to welcome everybody to listening to the first episode. This, of course, being episode 1, to give you guys a little bit of information about what you'll be listening to in the coming episodes. A Lifetime in NASCAR is going to highlight NASCAR's illustrious history. We're going to provide some analysis and anecdotes from co-host Aaron Burns, that's me, Ben White, that's Ben. Contemporary NASCAR topics, playoffs, silly season, rules changes, classic races, classic drivers. We're going to discuss those with a historic slant, also talking about how they impact current NASCAR. We're going to highlight all sorts of different interesting stories. In every 1-hour episode, you're going to learn about where the sport's been, where it's going to go, and the inside scoop on some of the craziest stories you'll ever hear. So to get things kicked off, Ben, tell me a little bit about where you are in NASCAR, how you got started in it, and how long you've been involved.
I sure can, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I guess my story starts April 16th, 1972. That was the day that my dad took myself and a couple of brothers and a couple of friends to Darlington Raceway. And I didn't know anything about NASCAR at all. The only thing I knew was that I had heard of Richard Petty, but I really didn't know a lot about it. So we go that particular Sunday, and I tell you what, I can still feel the sun. I can still smell the rubber and the tires. It was such a great experience for us. And my mom had packed a cooler of sandwiches and her famous brownies. And by the way, we went by and had to get some really cheap sodas for the day, and they were like 10 cents a piece at the local grocery store.
I wish that was still the case.
Yeah, I wish it was too. And so we just packed it in there, and I really didn't know what to expect. But the one thing I remember was that the 40-car field, every driver in the field had a hand out the window to say, "Welcome to the race. We're going to give you a great show." And I thought, man, that is the coolest thing. So my brother Doug actually started pulling for Richard Petty that day. And again, none of us knew anything about racing. And he saw the 43 car go by, and he said, "Well, I'll pull for that guy." And my dad had, believe it or not, had a Mercury exactly like David Pearson's Wood Brothers Mercury, and he drove as a company car. So he said, "Well, hey, that's my car. I'll drive that." Well, I saw a number 12 Coca-Cola Chevrolet go by, and I thought, hey, I love Coke, and that's like a really pretty paint scheme. I'm going to go for that guy.
That's perfect.
I really didn't know who it was actually till I saw a lineup and saw it was Bobby Allison. So, and as fate would have it, Bobby and I wrote a book together and became very close friends out of the deal. But just, it was such a great time. And then in 1983, after working for Richard Childress as a crew member, and before that driving race cars on a local level, I decided to go the other way and go into journalism, and have worked for the Lexington Dispatch newspaper for 37 years. And also throughout that time worked for NASCAR Illustrated as managing editor and senior editor, and also NASCAR Scene, if you remember those publications.
Oh, I was a subscriber, man. When I was a kid, we subscribed to Winston Cup Scene, so I definitely know.
Yeah. So those were awesome, publications. And in the past 10 years, I've worked for several publications, many, and I love NASCAR. I love being a part of it, and I feel so blessed to be able to do this as a profession, and it's kind of like being paid to love my hobby, and I love it.
I completely know where you're coming from. So for me, I think my story in racing really began, the first race I ever saw, and I don't remember this, but the first race that I ever saw was the 1988 Daytona 500, and it was the first race that was right after I was born. So I was only about 2 months old. So I was born in November of 1987. And I instantly got into it. My parents, my mom and dad, my grandmother and granddaddy, they were big race fans. Most of them rooted for Bill Elliott, except my dad's a Dale Earnhardt fan. And I instantly got into it. And so one of the first things that attracted me was seeing the light blue STP car. So I was a Richard Petty fan from the time I was 1 or 2 years old. That was big for me, was Richard Petty. That was my guy. The first time I ever went to a racetrack, I was 3. I wasn't quite 4 years old. It was September of 1991 at North Wilkesboro. It was qualifying for the Tyson Holly Farms 400. This was when Harry Gant was going through his run. trying to win 5 races in a row, and he almost did, but I think he had brake problems, and Dale Earnhardt passed him in the last couple of laps, and a bummer because we still haven't seen anybody win 5 races in a row since Richard Petty, but it was such an incredible experience for me. I don't remember a ton from it, but as far as being inside the racetrack, but I vividly remember seeing Junior Johnson and his farm and everything. I got to meet Junior. I got to meet Sterling Marlin. I met Rusty Wallace. It was, fortunately, my parents took a lot of pictures, so we still have them. So it was this really incredible experience. And then the next year, we went to our first race, which was the Winston at Charlotte, and it was the first time they had ever done it at night. And it was just this incredibly electric atmosphere. And if I'm not mistaken, Ben, did you cover that race?
I did, yes.
So, I mean, from my experience, I was a 4-year-old kid in the grandstands with the Richard Petty hat on and a mullet. And the biggest, hey, it was in style then. And the biggest thing for me was just getting to see all these superstars in person. It was just this incredible, visceral experience of seeing all these, these bright colors, flying by at 175 miles an hour. Davey Allison dominated the first couple of segments in the race. We all thought he was going to win. I was honestly pretty bored looking back. I made up excuses to have my dad take me to the bathroom every 15 laps in the first 2 segments because
that's funny.
I thought it was kind of boring, and he was pleading with me for the final 10 laps to stay in the seat, and I wasn't going to miss it. So they had this incredible finish where Davey's running third, and as you well recall, Kyle and Dale Earnhardt almost come together. Earnhardt's leading when they take the white flag. He spins out in turn 3. Kyle Petty takes the lead shortly, and Davey passes him at the line as they make contact. And Davey slams in the wall, and even my parents to this day vividly remember the fact that Davey got hurt pretty bad in that crash, and as he's laying in the car and they're trying to cut him out of the car, nobody left. Everybody in the grandstands just stayed and watched because they wanted to make sure that he was okay. And I think all those things, that incredible finish, the history-making part of it with the partnership between the Speedway and Musco Lighting to put together the first super speedway night race ever, it was something that, as great as things can be after that, I think can only be new once. And it was just absolutely phenomenal. If I wasn't hooked then, I talked with Robert Yates later about this, and he was like, "Oh, it hooked you, didn't?" And I was like, man, if I wasn't hooked by that point, there was no question. So spent my entire childhood, like you, after my first race as a big race fan. As I got to middle school, Dale Earnhardt Jr. came up into the Xfinity Series and then the Cup Series, and I kind of made him my favorite driver because I thought it was so cool that my dad would pull for Dale Earnhardt Sr. and I'd pull for Dale Earnhardt Jr. So you got the father pulling for the father, the son pulling for the son. And as I got to college, I had always had this interest in being a part of the motorsports world. When I was really little, I used to play with the diecast cars, but I wouldn't pretend I was a driver. I got friends who, they'd sit their cars on the floor in the living room like I did, and they'd make themselves onto the field. Well, I pretended I was Bob Jenkins of ESPN Speed World, and I would do the diehard starting lineup. I would go down, all the way to 20th or 25th place or whatever. When I got bored or needed to take a break, I would actually try to recite some of the commercials from the ESPN Speed World commercial breaks. Cool. You made it a whole broadcast. And if my mom did something that made me mad, and she loves to tell this story, if she did something that made me mad, I would be like, "Oh, we've got trouble in turn 4. Bill Elliott's involved." That's too good. That was my way of getting at her, and then she thinks that's still funny, and I barely remember it, but and that was in mid 90s or so. It was in between the time he was driving for Junior Johnson and then went to his own team with Charles Hardy in the McDonald's car, and then started pulling for Dale Jr. and like I said, got into college and had still followed NASCAR a lot, and by then I was a communications major at Lenore Ryan University, had a significant amount of interest in being a sports journalist, and not long after college, after I graduated, a couple years later, I covered my first NASCAR race in 2012, the All-Star race and the Sprint Showdown, which was pretty neat because it was 20 years after the first time I attended a race. I covered one for the first time. That's cool. That's neat. And then a couple years later, started National Speed Sport News, working for them, covering NASCAR, a little bit of Formula One, World Outlaws, IndyCar. Gave me a chance to broaden the horizons, which had already been pretty expansive for me since I've watched IndyCar and F1 since the mid-90s. But that was a great experience for me. Then I worked for Charlotte Motor Speedway for 4 years in their public relations department. So that's a place where I've obviously got a lot of history. And, like you, I think that's where we met, Ben, if I'm not mistaken, was in the media center at Charlotte.
I think so. And actually, I believe we met because I was doing some program stories for you and had the honor of working with you on those. And that's kind of how we met a few years back. So, yeah, it was good. But, talking about Davey, Allison, that first race, that you saw, it was a phenomenal evening to have a race. And I'll tell you, for months and months prior to that, people were telling Humpy Wheeler, who was the former president and general manager of Charlotte Motor Speedway, said, you can't light a speedway this big. You just can't do it. And, Musco came in, and I think it was a price tag of about $1 million, but they put it together and had mirrors, I remember, on the inside to help reflect the lights on the outside. And it was a great race. And then, of course, we see what happened with Davey and Kyle Petty. And, Davey did get hurt in that wreck. He did come back a few days later. I'm sure he raced the next week. But that's the first time that I remember in my lifetime, even as a fan, that a driver did not go to victory lane.
Yeah.
Because of that, because he was injured. And, of course, Robert Yates accepted the trophy. But, yeah, and that piece of sheet metal on I believe it was the... Yeah, it was the left side of the car that he put in the wall. Mm-hmm. That thing hung in Robert Yates Racing shop for years after that. Yeah, and not years because it was hit. Davey wasn't there, but because of the helicopter crash, I guess a couple of years later. But it did hang there from the day of the night that happened, the day after they hung that sheet metal up there, just to say, we've been through some tough times, and this was a tough time, but we can get through things. In those days, by the way, the crew members, you might have, if you really tried hard, counting the guy who swept the floor, you might have 20 people, not 500 like we've got today.
It's changed so much, man.
It has.
You're so right.
It sure has. Yeah, and it was a really neat group of guys who got together, and then they're more like family, and they did several jobs on the race car. But Davey was just a phenomenal person, a phenomenal driver, but also a phenomenal person. I really miss him a lot. He was a good friend.
I would have loved to have met Davey Allison. We went to an autograph session. I went with my parents at the mall in Gastonia in 92, around the time of the All-Star race in the 600, and we met several drivers, and Dave was supposed to be there, and he didn't make it. And I told Bobby Allison that years later, and he was like, that's so out of character for him. And then I kind of put two and two together that he was probably still getting checked up in the hospital, because not only had he got knocked out in that crash in the Winston, he'd also broken some ribs, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So they were probably advising him to not go anywhere, which I completely understand. But he was just a truly fascinating person, an incredible race car driver. When I was younger, I made some comparisons between Davey and Dale Jr., in particular how good they were at restrictor plate races and how they would make the grandstands at Talladega Superspeedway erupt like nobody else could.
That's true. They sure did.
And now,
they sure did.
Yeah, and now you've got that another driver who's coming up through the ranks, and he's already done something that Davey and Dale Jr. and a lot of legends didn't do, and that's win a championship. That's Chase Elliott. And I feel like Chase kind of has some of those qualities, Ben, where he's grown up in the sport. His dad didn't make everything super easy on him. He had to earn his way, and from a very young age, he proved how fast he was on the racetrack.
Oh, yeah, and one of the things with Davey and also with several drivers from that era, Kyle Petty too, that their fathers made them learn as much as they possibly could about race cars, and especially Bobby, because he didn't want to hand Davey a race car and say, here, go race it. He wanted him to understand the intricate pieces of the car and the engine and chassis and so forth. So when he was on the racetrack, then if he heard something, in the final laps and route to a checkered flag, that he'd know what it was. And so Bobby was very adamant about, you need to build your own race car. cars. And so for years prior to his driving career, he worked for Bobby Allison Racing as a crew member. Davey did. Mm-hmm. And that was very instrumental in him knowing how to handle race cars, and even worked on, within those 20 guys, you could very much see Davey under the car and doing things with the car because he wanted to, not because he had to, but
right.
He's like, I just want to be under here to fix the brakes or do whatever needs to be done. Same thing with Chase. He grew up in a racing family, but he wasn't as much of a silver spoon as you might think, because Bill did tell me once, he said, look, we knew how much money we were going to put into his career, and if he did not succeed in that amount of money or time, we were going to have to say no, because he knew how expensive it was. And then about the time they were just about to run out of money, then things started to come together and he started winning and got some great breaks. But don't think for a second that any of that was handed to Chase, because they were on a strict budget, and he made sure it's like, this may or may not work. And that's why you see Chase being so incredibly humble now. Anytime he wins a race, he doesn't boast about it. He's very giving, of the crew and making sure they've got, the accolades that they need. And
yeah.
So, I mean, that he was just one of those guys that did come up the hard way, even though his dad was Bill Elliott. But that's what made Bill, so popular too, is the fact that people just loved him because he was just like everybody else around Dawsonville. Same thing with Chase, and I admire that about Chase. A lot of this could go to his head, and he's not let it do that.
The first time I talked to Chase, it was more than 8 years ago. I was just starting out freelancing for National Speed Sport News before I worked for him full time. And the first story I ever did was for the Battle at the Beach, the big late model and modified race that they were doing on the backstretch at Daytona. And Chase Elliott was announced that he was going to be in it. So I was like, well, I got to talk to this kid. I've started hearing about him now, and he's winning K&N Pro races. So maybe he's going to make something of himself. So I lined it up, gave him a call, talked to him for like 30 minutes. Super well-spoken, knowledgeable, well beyond his years. I think at that point he was, 16 maybe. Our birthdays are almost identical, and I don't think it was quite mine, so I assume it wasn't his. And then a year later, when he was in the Truck Series driving the very appropriate, awesomely named Aaron's Chevrolet for Henry Motorsports, the number 94. Man, I need that diecast. I used to collect so many diecasts. I don't really buy them anymore, but that's one maybe I should add to the collection. But I talked to Chase for and you know this just as well as I do, with how many things have changed in the NASCAR scope over the last couple of decades, how difficult it is to pin down a driver for 15, 20 minutes for an interview. I talked to Chase in a phone interview for at least 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And the subject matter ranged from certainly his goals. At that point, it wasn't a certain thing that he was going to run full-time in the Truck Series in 2014, let alone in the Xfinity Series, where he ended up with Junior Motorsports and he won the championship as a rookie. At this point, we didn't know that. We just knew that Chase had won one Truck Series race, and he'd shown some promise. People were beginning to think he was going to be really good in NASCAR, and it was amazing how well-spoken, down-to-earth, like you mentioned, that Chase was, even at that point, and very open to talking about things within the sport, about his family, about his friends. Ryan Blaney was coming up, about the same time as Chase and their buddies, just like Bubba Wallace and several other young guns. And we talked baseball and we talked football for a while. So, he has that ability for a lot of people who can relate to him regardless of their background. And that's the same kind of quality that Dale Jr. had that made Dale Jr. so popular. It's something that made Davey so popular for many people who have told me who were friends with Davey. Chase has that kind of ability too. And it's not just the driving talent. It's not just the famous last name. In each of these three cases, to me, it's the fact that they stand out in a crowd not because of their ability, but because of their personality and how people can relate to them. And that's one thing I've always respected about Chase. And certainly this year, as I'm sure you'd agree, Ben, it was fantastic to see him win his first Cup championship. And, as I've said since then, it seems like the next 10 years are definitely going to be the William Clyde Elliott II era for NASCAR.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Aaron. I think so. And if you look back at Martinsville, of this past year. I mean, Chase had to race his way into that. It wasn't a given, and he raced his way into the Final Four, and then he just went out there like Jack the Bear and just put everybody in a different time zone because they were prepared and they got the job done. But I mean, even if you talk to Chase today, he would say, I don't know if I'll ever win another race. And you're like, well, of course you will. I said, well, you don't ever know. You don't ever know because, I mean, that humble style that he gives, it's not something that's been created by a PR firm or anything. It's very genuine. And if you look back at Bill and Ernie and Dan back in the 1985 when they won the Winston Million, same sort of thing. Back in those days, I do recall personally going into the garage when Bill Elliott was running for the Winston Million at Darlington, and he was, where's Bill? Well, he's under the car, working on the chassis. And there's the guy who was going to go for $1 million. And in those days, that was a big, big deal too.
Yeah.
And those guys were just very, very accommodating when they could be. But you got to understand, I mean, it was all over the world being talked about how they were up for the Winston Million. And that, again, we see a lot of money in racing today, but $1 million in '85 was quite a bit of money. And so those guys worked really hard, and they were criticized a little bit for being what so-called standoffish at times. But the fact was that they were out there running for $1 million. It's like, we're here and we've got one shot at this. As it turned out, they ended up winning the Winston Million. So it goes back to that humble racer, and you saw it with Dale Earnhardt. That's why he was so popular. Humble about what they were doing, the way they came up, not letting any of this go to their head. The success could be taken away at any point. We saw that with some drivers where their careers ended abruptly, sadly, and so you just have to realize that it's not a given, and every win that you have is a blessing and a gift.
So you may not know, but I've heard this rumor that when Bill was going for the Winston Million in '85, which is incredible to think about also because the fact that you had to win 3 of the sport's 4 supposed crown jewel races at the time, and this was in an era where reliability was pretty bad. He was able to do that, but if I'm not mistaken, and you could be able to correct me, didn't Winston and R.J. Reynolds promise this in '85? It was the first year they had offered the Winston Million, but at the time, I don't think they had the money. No, did they?
They did not have the money. It's funny you bring that up. They didn't have it. They went to New York in December of 1984, and they offered this $1 million deal, and everybody's like, "Wow, this is the coolest thing in the world." And then, as each time that Bill won a race, he won the Daytona 500. He had some brake issues, I think, at Charlotte, if I'm not mistaken, and so he did not win at Charlotte. I think he came back from 2 laps down at Talladega. Just think about how that was. I mean, good Lord, that was quite an accomplishment in itself to come back from 2 laps there. And of course, he goes to Darlington. Well, as you're right, as Tom and the late great Denny Darnell told me this story, who worked for Winston. So they didn't have the money, so they had to shuffle some things around and come up with the $1 million. But they didn't think anybody was going to win it. They hoped somebody would. Let's think about it. They thought that, okay, we're going to run this program every year, and it's going to be 2-3 years. It's got to be before somebody can put together something like this, let alone a little tiny team out of Podunk, Dawsonville. I mean, it just came together, and they're like, how are we going to pay this bill? So anyway, yeah, you're right. That's exactly the story, that they didn't have it and they had to come up with it.
And I think one of the reasons, it never really dawned on me until we started discussing this just now, but I bet you one of the reasons that they started it in late '84 and began it for '85 was in 1984, there was a lot of parity in the Cup Series. I mean, there was 3 or 4 guys who could have won a championship late in the year. It looked like Harry Gant had a great shot at it. Terry Labonte wound up winning his first Cup championship, not his last certainly, in '84, but nobody separated themselves from the pack in 1984. So I would imagine that the Winston and the RJ Reynolds people were thinking, well, it'll probably be the same thing in 85. And my gosh, they were incredibly wrong, because Bill Elliott won 11 races. And were it not for some reliability issues, like you mentioned, he probably would have bagged 15. And the incredible finish to that Bill Elliott story in 85, which is incredible. We could spend multiple episodes talking about this, and I'm sure we're going to go back to it frequently. But for all that success, for all the money that they won, they didn't win the championship. And what amazes me is that history seemed to forget that was Darrell Waltrip's last championship season, but nobody remembers the fact Bill didn't win the championship, because 1985, when you think 1985, if you're a longtime NASCAR fan, you only think of one thing. You think of Bill Elliott winning the Winston Million, because, as you said, nobody thought he could do it. He had to overcome so much. That race at Talladega, imagine Chase Elliott winning at Talladega next year, coming from 2 laps down. The headlines would be Elliott puts together this incredible comeback. NASCAR Twitter would explode. There'd be people talking on YouTube. There'd be podcasts. Everybody'd be talking about how Chase Elliott came from 2 laps down. But he'd have the benefit of getting the free pass, getting a lap back, taking a wave around. Bill Elliott didn't have those advantages in 1985. He had to do it with pure raw speed, and that Melling Coors Ford, man, that thing could fly, couldn't it?
Oh, gosh, yeah. And it was so amazing to see how that would unfold, because when he went down that second lap, everybody's like, well, he's, there goes the Winston Million. They're not going to do it. And it's, it was a great story while it lasted and all that. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, he got that lap back. And then, wait a minute, he's back into this thing again, and he ends up winning it. But you're right about what you said about 84, because the one thing that came to mind when you were talking was the Talladega race. I believe it was the last Talladega race in 84. They had a tremendous amount of lead changes in that race. And I don't remember the number, but it's like crazy, the number of people that had, led that race. And at the end, I do remember it was like 15 cars, and Earnhardt won it, but it was 15 cars going for the win, and very, very close in competition in that year. So you're right. There was so many people who could have done it, and Bill and Dan Elliott, Ernie Elliott, and those, again, close-knit crew members put together a phenomenal season and won it. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, pretty sure that Bill Elliott won 11 races that year, but he didn't win the title. And so it's just crazy how it all worked out. And that's performance driven, because as you saw Darrell Waltrip come up and won the championship in 85. So he did win, but it was either win or not do so great. And as far as Bill Elliott's team went, that's why they lost the title.
Yeah. And, looking at Bill's 1985 and considering the bit that's really become trivia, and the fact that he didn't win the championship, is very comparable, if you're a pretty new NASCAR fan, to what Kevin Harvick did this year in winning 9 races. And frankly, I think at various points past the halfway point of the season, I think a lot of us thought that Kevin Harvick almost had a bye into the final race of the year at Phoenix, because he had won so many races and had so many playoff points that you're thinking, all right, the guy could take 2 races off during the last 10 and probably still advance, because not only does he have all these playoff points, they're also just so much faster than everybody else. And it was yet another example of the unpredictability of NASCAR rising to the forefront, in that they just didn't have it on the short tracks when it mattered, particularly at Martinsville in the playoffs, which is very similar to Bill Elliott in 85. Those guys struggled at the short tracks. Darrell Waltrip owned the short tracks and for the early to mid 1980s, and that wound up costing Bill, who was much quicker on the intermediate and the faster tracks. Again, not unlike Kevin Harvick in this past season, who was incredibly quick. And speaking of 2020 and NASCAR, Chase Elliott winning the last couple of races of the season, winning the championship. As of this recording, we're just a couple days removed from the fact that Chase's win streak finally ended. He did not win the Snowball Derby at Five Flags Speedway in Pensacola, Florida, the famous late model race. Chase started, I think, outside the top 30 in this race and still rallied to finish in the top 3. So it was an incredible drive from somebody who has proven himself to be one of few drivers in NASCAR, in my opinion, Ben, who don't really have a weakness in terms of a type of a track. Like Chase, maybe Kyle Busch, maybe Joey Logano. I would say, and you could argue Kevin Harvick as well, certainly. Those are the guys who, to me, if it's a road course, if it's a super speedway, if it's a short track, if it's an intermediate track like Charlotte, like Darlington, Atlanta, or Texas, they're good at all of them. They can win any given week, and it's a true testament to the talent that these guys have, that they just don't seem to have a weakness, and that makes these championship battles so much more fun too.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, as you were talking, I thought back on something that Bill Elliott said when he was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and he was sitting there with Ray Evernham, who helped to induct him. And they were talking about, they went to, I don't recall the name of the speedway. It's one of the smaller Georgia short tracks, I think. But they put Chase in a late model car, and they were just out there to get him some laps and see how he'd do. And they kept looking at each other like, this kid's really got something special. He just has that feel, and can't explain it, but he's got the feel. And so they were both amazed at how well he could adapt to whatever they threw at him. You know, they would put things in the car chassis wise to where, okay, this is going to cause him this problem or that problem, and didn't seem to faze him at all. He went on and turned some really good laps. So you're right. There are some people that are just so good everywhere they went, and they could adapt to anything. And going back to history just a smidge here, Bobby Allison was that way. He could drive anything.
Definitely.
And he could just, whether it was a sports car, whether it was a stock car, whether it was an Indy car. He ran 2 Indy 500s. A lot of people may not know that, but he drove for Roger Penske in 1973 and 75. And he would go to places, and someone would say, hey, can you hop in my car and see what you can do? Well, he would turn laps better than they were. And he actually, in all honesty, made a few drivers mad because he showed them up.
Oh, I'm sure he made a bunch of them mad with how good he was.
Yeah, I mean, he was so good at adapting to whatever they threw at him. And I believe he would have done well at Indianapolis had he not had mechanical failures both of those races. But back to Chase, he was the same way. And I go to Jeff Gordon on this. Jeff was one of those drivers that could hop in anything and do well in it. And so it's just, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just a natural feel for a race car. And Chase, I believe, certainly has that.
So obviously Chase, with him finishing number one in the championship this year, very well deserved. This being episode number 1, why don't we talk a little bit about the origins of the car number 1 and some of the people who've had success with that number. And I'll start with you, Ben. Who are some of the guys that, when you think of the 1 car, who comes to mind?
Well, there's a few. The first one, I guess, that comes to mind, and growing up with him, is Donnie Allison drove the number 1 for Haas Ellington. Actually, looking at the record books, there were 18 victories logged in the number 1, and those drivers who did win in the car, Donnie Allison had 4 wins, Jamie McMurray had 4 wins. And another driver, Billy Wade, back in the 60s, won 4 consecutive races for Budmore Engineering in the Northern Tour. And they would go up to, say, Bridgehampton, New York, and Islip, and those types of racetracks. He won 4 in a row there. And then you have, of course, Kurt Busch has won a couple in the number 1. So there was a total of, and there was a guy named Paul Lewis, by the way, I think, that won a couple of races too. So the number 1 is well known out there. But I think the number 1, if you had to really narrow it down, as far as history goes, the number 1 with Donnie Allison driving for Haas Ellington. Of course, they got in the 1979 Daytona 500 fight with Bobby Allison and Cale Yarborough. I think that's the number 1 that really comes to mind. And there's other drivers that have driven the number 1 that just did not go to victory in those.
So. When I think of the 1, the guy who drove the 1 car when I was a kid was Rick Mast, who won the pole for the first Brickyard 400, which is an incredible accomplishment. And I know it really aggravated Dale Earnhardt because he wound up hitting the wall in lap 1 because he wanted to lead the first lap so bad because he didn't win the pole. But I think of Rick Mast in that black and white Skoal Ford. Before that, I think it was an Oldsmobile. And I think of him. He didn't win a cup race, but to me, I think Rick Mast and those guys from Rockridge, Bass, Virginia, I think they're probably, he's one of the 10 best of the last 30 years to have not won a Cup Series points race. I think he showed a lot of skill as a driver for the various teams that he drove for. He came out of nowhere for a lot of people in the 89 Daytona 500, driving an unsponsored 66 car for Travis Carter.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
And nearly won the race. He was driving the big Monte Carlos. It was the last time they were going to run those at Daytona before they switched the Lumina, and he gave him a show, man. And I think I've always thought very highly of his skill as a driver. And another one who drove the one car to me, and I always will associate him with the number one car, is Steve Park. And Steve Park's story is one which is, I'm not sure how familiar a lot of people are with him, but this was a guy who came up through the ranks as a tremendous modified driver in the 1980s and 1990s. His dad, Bob Park, is a legend in the Northeast in the modified ranks. Got to the Cup Series driving for Dale Earnhardt Sr. in 97 in a limited schedule, and then moved up full-time in 98, driving the number one Pennzoil car. And that's what I remember about Steve Park, is in this Pennzoil car. It took him a couple years to win his first race. He won it at its home track in Watkins Glen in 2000. But in 2001, Steve Park was genuinely, he was a low-key championship contender in the first half of the season. This guy was just banging out top fives. He wasn't boom or bust. He was very consistent. And at that time, of course, there was no chase, there was no playoffs, and consistency could be very rewarded. And there was a big chunk of that 01 season where Steve Park was in the top 4 or 5 in points. And then you get to Darlington and the Southern 500 weekend, and he's running in the Busch race. And I remember this quite vividly. I was actually going with my dad to the flea market outside of Morganton, North Carolina, close to where we're from, where I could get some die-cast cars and probably some basketball cards or something. I was 13 years old, and, simple 13-year-old interest at that time for a kid from North Carolina. But somebody had the Busch race on TV, and you just walk by and you see, well, there's the race is red flagged, all the cars are stopped. That's not good. It's not raining, so what's the deal? And then they show this car that's a tarp over it. And as well, when you saw a tarp over a race car at any point, you're like, okay, that's bad. Mm-hmm. And so then you find out, that it's Park. I didn't even know he was running in the Busch race that weekend, driving the Wheeling car. I think it was number 31. And it was such a freak thing. I mean, it's when you look at the history of serious NASCAR accidents, so many of them can be classified as that's just racing. Davey had a couple of those. Dale Jr. did. A lot of them have. With Steve Park, so he's going down the backstretch, if I recall, and he's swerving back and forth. They're under caution. And as he's moving back and forth to keep his tires warm, the steering wheel comes off in his hands. And that's not that big of a deal, because, it's going to take you a second to reattach it, but you're under caution. So, you're not going to hit the wall. He's not going that quickly. So it's just going to veer him off the line of cars under caution, but nobody's going fast. So he's not going to get hit. Well, that's wrong, because there was somebody coming up to get their lap back, because the lap cars lined up on the inside. This was 8 years before the double file restarts in NASCAR. And so this guy's coming up behind him, and it just so happens he's approaching Steve Park. His car veers left, hard left, all of a sudden, and it gets T-boned, just clobbered by this lapped car. Mm-hmm. And just one of the most freak things. And I remember seeing it in the replay. Alan Bestwick was announcing the race, and he thought Steve Park got hit. I mean, there was just no way to understand this. And he underwent, so many surgeries. I had heard that the guy had to learn how to walk again. I mean, it was just this major neurological injury that Steve Park had because of this really weird accident. And I was so glad to see him, as I'm sure everybody in NASCAR was. We were so glad to see the guy come back and race in the Cup Series in that one car barely a year later. And then he had that bad wreck at Pocono with Dale Jr., where one of them gets clipped, spins in front of the other, and then Park's flipping down the backstretch. And everybody's holding their breath thinking, my gosh, there's no way this is happening to such a nice guy. And regrettably, he never achieved that success that it looked like he was on the precipice of achieving when he had that injury. He'd won at Rockingham the week after we lost Dale Earnhardt Sr. and looked like he was going to win a lot of other races. He came back. It didn't quite work out for him. He kept racing in the Cup Series for several years. I finally met Steve last year at Charlotte before the monster truck race they have at the dirt track. I handled publicity for the dirt track for 3 years, and one of the things that we did to promote the monster truck race is we did a school bus race on the dirt track, and Steve Park was one of the drivers. Wow. And he was super cool to deal with. It was a thrill for me. I was a Steve Park fan when I was a kid. Anything DEI, when DEI started with the Ron Hornaday in the 16 Papa John's truck, I was all DEI. That was my team. And so obviously I was a big Steve Park fan, and I had never met the guy. So this was this huge thrill for me to meet him finally. Mm-hmm. And, it was the first time I'd seen Steve race in probably 6 or 7 years. I'm sorry, probably 16 or 17 years, which is depressing. But it had been forever since I'd seen the guy race in a Cup car, and he was racing a school bus. But he was super cool to deal with, and that's what I think of when I think of the one car. So he didn't have that success as some of the guys that you mentioned, Ben, but he was a really interesting character.
He was. And, there's another crash that unfortunately that he suffered was at Atlanta and broke his leg. I believe it was his left leg, but it was in the thigh area. So he had to, do a good bit of rehabilitation for that. And, of course, that for a time, even though it was a positive for Darrell Waltrip, was Dale Earnhardt Sr. went to him and said, I need some help. And so put Darrell in the car. And he has actually had a pretty good few months in the car winning. I mean, he didn't win any races, but top fives and top tens. Mm-hmm. And it was a real good combination. But he was there to help Steve out. But, it's just sad that I agree with you. It's sad that he didn't, win more races. He was very capable and very talented, but circumstance just didn't deal him the right cards. But he'll always be remembered for the guy who won the race for DEI the week after Dale Earnhardt passed away in 2001. So, I had to put a positive spin on it. And he was very emotional in Victory Lane, as we all were. And it was very difficult that weekend. It was just such a strange feeling to know that Dale Earnhardt was not there. And I think Steve brought some positive, back. And we all had to heal. And I think in a lot of respects, we're still healing 20 years later. Mm-hmm. It's going to be 20 years this coming February, just when we go to Daytona. It's hard for me to believe it's been 20 years. But Steve was part of that healing process, and it's a brick at a time that you have to build a wall of, to get back to 100% anytime you lose a loved one. And, maybe always get back to being 100% after you lose a loved one, I should say that. But in a positive light, though, he was a great driver, and glad to see that he's still with us, and he might, who knows, he might be on a short track somewhere right now testing a race car. You just never know about Steve.
He might be testing a school bus for all we know.
It could be. That's right.
So you mentioned people who the circumstances didn't deal a great hand to. Steve Park, as we mentioned, is a prime example. But when I think of the word circumstances, I think of the guy who said famously, you don't worry about winning, you put yourself in the position to win, and you let the circumstances handle the rest. And that's Richard Petty. Richard Petty, for episode 1 of A Lifetime in NASCAR, is our driver of the week, the first driver of the week that we've ever had. Certainly not the last, certainly a very deserving one, being the all-time leading race winner in the history of the NASCAR Cup Series with 200 wins, a mark which is quite unattainable, I feel safe to say. Ben, you and I both grew up admiring Richard Petty, as I think millions and millions of people across the United States did. What are some of your favorite memories of the King?
Oh, well, there's a bunch, but I've talked to Dale Inman about this, and Richard a little bit too, but his racing career, I guess if you really want to go way back to day one, would be when he and Dale Inman would race bicycles to the creek to fish. I mean, that's how far back it went. And being the son of Lee Petty, a 3-time NASCAR champion, of course, they had a rule growing up that, okay, you can't go play basketball, you can't go fishing, you can't go to these things until the car is ready to race. And that was back when they were 11, 12 years old. So they would air up the tires and they would change the oil and make sure it had gas and whatever, small things they could do as an 11, 12-year-old. Then they'd go ride bikes. And so for Richard, I mean, he knew exactly what he was going to do. And, he told me a funny story about how, Lee Petty ran the number 42 throughout his career. And I've asked Kyle about this, and Kyle said, I'm really not sure where the 42 came from. I think it came off the end of a car tag, a North Carolina car tag, which where that the 42 came from. Well, Richard told me, he said, what I wanted to do is I wanted to have the number 24 before, because my dad had the 42. I just wanted to, do the opposite.
Really?
So there was a guy who was racing the number 24 at the time, and he went to him and said, hey, would you let me have the 24? My dad's got 42. Really would love to have it. And he wouldn't let him have it because he said, well, no, 24 is my number. So he said I kind of sulked and got ticked for a week or two. And finally I just said, oh, what the heck? I'll just put 43 on it. And lo and behold, I mean, it's the greatest race car number of all time.
Yeah.
But that's how that all came about, is that he really wanted 24 and the guy wouldn't let him have it. So, there's just a bazillion stories about the King. But the one thing I want to say about him, I don't know of any change in his personality from the day I met him in 1983 to now. He has been just as down to earth and classy of a guy that you could ever meet. You think, well, this guy's got every right in the world to be standoffish and untouchable. Not Richard Petty. He is the absolute king because he's the greatest ambassador NASCAR's ever had. And just that whole Petty family, and I'll quickly share this. The Linda Petty, who has passed away, sadly, we're sorry for her loss. Mm-hmm. She would require that all of the Petty kids, Kyle and Rebecca and Lisa and all of them, every Christmas they would wrap gifts and they would put boy, girl on them and they would put an age on them. And then they didn't know the children they were giving gifts to, but they would fill their station wagon to the brim with Christmas presents. And they would just, now you're in charge of this area over here, and you're in charge of this area over here, and you're in charge of this area over here. And they would give all these out. And Kyle would say, we didn't know the people, but we'd knock on the door and we'd hand them the gift. And which really helped others, make their Christmases really special.
Definitely.
And he said, yeah, and he said, Mom would say, if you cannot leave it on the porch, if they're not there when you go by, you have to go back. And you got to sit down with them and wish them a Merry Christmas. Well, I mean, that tells you everything right there. The Pettys, Richard, Linda, all them, and it extended to Maurice, his brother, and Lee, and just a down-to-earth, really good family of people, on top of being so great as a NASCAR driver. And I just love the guy. I mean, every time I talk to him, he's got a big smile on his face, and he doesn't call me Ben. He says, hey, bud, every time I see him. and it's just so cool because it's like you have every right to be, way up on that pedestal somewhere, and you're not. He's just as down to earth a guy. And I know millions of people have met him mm-hmm. and just think the world of him. So that's my Petty stories. But he's that whole family's awesome.
I can completely agree. And so just to kind of underscore how much of a Richard Petty fan I've been, certainly now and as a kid, I actually dressed up as Richard Petty for Halloween twice.
Good deal. How about that?
Yeah, so I did it twice. My parents got me a hat that was like the King's and some sunglasses, and my mom actually cut out a little STP logo. I mean, you didn't have STP stickers then. A lot of these things weren't readily available in the late 80s, early 90s. I'm not sure if they even are now. But, the King, his sunglasses always had that little STP sticker on them. So my mom cut out a little STP picture from a magazine, and she put it on the sunglasses almost like it was a little sticker or decal. So I had that. I had an STP jacket with 43 on it with Richard Petty on it. I had the whole shebang, and I did that twice because of course you had the mustache and everything. Man, it was
how about that?
It was good. It was a whole deal. And when I look back as a kid, everybody has that one seminal Halloween outfit that they're proud of, or that they look back on and smile about, perhaps maybe more than others. And for me, it was Richard Petty, because this guy was the first hero I had outside of my family. When I was really little, he was larger than life. I mean, I remember being in first grade, somebody asking me where Richard Petty finished the race, and I was like, he retired, and just like had no patience for how could you not know that Richard Petty's not racing this year, and it's miserable. Rick Wilson's driving the 44 car. It's not the same, but when you're 5 years old, you quickly learn that you're probably not going to get to see him race a whole lot anymore, and we didn't. I did get to see him once in the 92 Winston, which was a great pleasure. As it was also his last top 10 finish in the Winston Cup Series. He finished ninth in that race. Ran in the top 2 for a little bit. And I'm not going to say it's because they inverted the field, even though it's mostly because they inverted the field. But, the King, it's so crazy. I don't think hardly anybody knew, I certainly didn't, the story of the family giving out presents to people, because I think a lot of us thought the greatest gifts Richard Petty gave to NASCAR fans were just the simple enjoyment of watching him dominate the field, the way he acted and conducted himself as the ultimate ambassador, not just for NASCAR, but for motor racing in general, for decades and decades. His popularity in a lot of ways kept NASCAR afloat during the 1970s and its period of economic instability, when they had to shorten some of the races because of a fuel shortage. So there was a lot of things going on, a lot of uncertainty in NASCAR. And Richard Petty was that unifying force that kept everything going, that kept people engaged, that kept sponsors wanting to come back, and that ultimately drove CBS to start broadcasting some of the races in 1979. So his impact as a driver, it's in, there's no way you can truly quantify it. As a fan, for me, I mean, I had Richard Petty t-shirt when I was 2 or 3 years old, and I still have a couple of Richard Petty hats. One that I bought from my buddy Brent Wentz at his store days gone by in Mooresville, not far from where I live. It's an original 1989 STP Richard Petty hat I got a year or two ago, and I still wear that pretty regularly. He's an icon in the sport. And as far as for me, I didn't get a chance to meet him in my childhood. I would have freaked out. I finally did when I was 15 at Speed Street in Uptown Charlotte. This was in May of 2003. He did an autograph session for Cheerios because they were the sponsor of the 43 car at the time. And to accurately date this, Ben, this was during the very short period where Christian Fittipaldi, the former Formula One driver, drove the 43 car. And so my dad and I went, and I met Richard Petty, and we didn't bring a camera because it just wasn't something we thought to do. And so we started talking with a couple Petty fans in line in front of us, and they had their camera. And so they're taking pictures of the King, and I'm posing for the pictures thinking they're taking them of me and him, because I'm just in awe. And they take like 7 or 8 pictures, and the King passing back. He's like, "Okay, buddy." So I let him go. He was super nice. And then the first time I interviewed him was in 2015 for a story for Speed Sport magazine about his win in the 81 Daytona 500, what wound up being his last 500 win. And it was just this great story. I have this picture. I gave him a copy of the magazine several months later in 2015 or 2016, and took a picture of him reading it, and it's just got this ultimate thrill. I don't think there's any way you can tell how many times he's just lightened up somebody's day because of things like that.
Oh, sure. And for me, there's probably 100 stories, but I'll share this one real quick. Actually, a couple of them real fast. But in 1992, we were at Pocono. I was with, of course, NASCAR Scene and Illustrated, as I said earlier, and I had written a piece for NASCAR Scene about what he should do about the number 43. And as writers, you're all the time struggling with something to write about next week and next week and next week.
Yeah.
And so I just picked it. It's like, well, this would just be something good to write about. And what I wrote about in the column that I wrote was that Richard Petty should run the number 44 in 1993 and then go back to 43 the next year, because it would be too hard of a transition for people to associate another driver with the 43 after so many years. And so we're in Pocono, and Chuck Spicer was his PR director, and Chuck came in the media center and says, "The King wants to see you." And I thought, oh crap.
It makes you feel like you're in medieval Europe when they say the King wants to see you.
I know. And it's like, what have I mean, I was, and I have to admit, just a bit of fear went over me. It's like, oh, I've made him mad some way.
Yeah.
So I walked over to the truck, and I sat down on the back of the transporter there, waiting to get scolded or whatever. And he come out, he said, "Hey man, how you doing?" I said, "Great." I said, "What have I done wrong?" He said, nothing. I loved your article, and I think I'm going to do that. And we talked about the intricacies of moving to 44 and how cool it would be, and go back to 43. And I was like, man, that's the coolest thing. And a friend of mine snapped a photo of us sitting on the back of the transporter talking about that. And I just thought, I mean, little old me, you're going to listen to little old me about this, and that's kind of the way I felt about it. But I was just honored that he read it and he thought that was a great idea, and they ended up doing that. But the second thing I wanted to tell you, though, Aaron, was very quickly, my son, Aaron, by the way, is the same name. When he was 16 years old, he went with me to interview Richard Petty at the Petty Enterprises there when they were back there. And so we got to talking about crashes and things, I think for some story I was working on. And so he told my son, Aaron, he said, listen, he said, there's something I need you to hear me say. What's that? I said, when you get in trouble and you know you're in trouble, ball up behind the wheel as tight as you can and just, stay tight behind the wheel. Wear your seatbelt and all that, but just stay tight. Okay, well, as it turned out, about 6 months later, Aaron was driving his Camaro, and he wasn't going very fast at all. There was a EMT in his personal car running behind him. And what happened was he got just a little bit off the pavement and got into a culvert, and it made the car flip. And so Aaron remembered what Richard said to him about, be tight in the car if you know you're in trouble. As it turned out, the car was heavily damaged. He probably would not be here today had he not gotten that advice, because the car was totally destroyed and the top was mashed down to the tops of the doors. And fortunately, he was not hurt. Thank the good Lord he wasn't hurt. But that was a key part of it, to be instructed on what to do. If you know you're in trouble and you can't stop it, if you're flipping or whatever, ball up. And I will always credit Richard Petty for helping to save him that day. And so he's all the time helping people any way he possibly can and wants nothing for it. He cares very deeply. He's a really good person, and I'm so fortunate to have a friendship with him.
So you're kind of at fault for Rick Wilson not making untold amounts of money in merchandise because he drove the STP 44 car.
It's totally my fault.
I'm sure by now he's gotten over it. I think it was a great idea, and frankly, I'm kind of surprised that some of the other legends since then haven't explored the same possibility. In particular, Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson, among several others. They're two I kind of thought, that it would be very appropriate to do that, and they opted not to do that for various reasons. But yeah, it's the King, and we'll talk a lot about the King, in the future, but in these future episodes. But it's amazing how much of an impact he's had on so many people, and how helpful he can be to people, and how there's so many people who have met him and just get that impression of, how this guy's just a genuinely good person. And he really is. And speaking of, around this time, Ben, you were covering races. I was watching them on TV in 1992. To wrap up episode 1, let's talk a little bit about the championship battle at Atlanta when the season used to end there, and certainly the most famous one, and for my money, one of the 3 or 4 most important races in NASCAR's history. It was Richard Petty's last race in 1992, but it was also so much more than just Richard Petty's last race. So tell me what you remember from that.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was electric. If you want to come up with a name for how it felt during that weekend, totally electric, and I can tell you exactly why. Richard Petty's last race, this new young kid with a mustache, Jeff Gordon's first race, they had 7, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, they had 7 drivers going into the final race who had a mathematical chance of winning the championship.
And Kyle Petty was one of them, right?
Yeah, Kyle was one of them. And all Davey Allison, all he had to do was finish, I believe, in the top 6. Maybe it wasn't even that far up to the top 12. I mean, he had it nailed.
Yeah,
okay?
He was in a good spot.
He was in a great spot. All he had to do is just finish, and he led some laps. And then, of course, that went away when he and Ernie Irvan got together on the front stretch. And very quickly, how cool Davey was about, he could have gotten upset. Very class act when he had to say, hey, we'll come back next year. And of course, that didn't happen because he passed away the next year. But as far as that particular race goes, there was so much going on. Then you get in the race, it's between Bill Elliott and Alan Kulwicki, and it comes down to leading the most laps and leading a lap. And that's where the 10 points came from Alan Kulwicki to win over Bill Elliott. But my friend Ken Martin, who works for NASCAR now, he worked for ESPN as a statistician. And they kept Bob Jenkins and Benny Parsons kept looking at him like,
yeah, he was that guy who had to do the numbers, right?
Yeah, who's going to win this thing? And Ken's like, I was really my hands were shaking because I kept telling him, this is who won, and it's going to be Kulwicki. He said everything was on the line, and it's the most amazing race I've ever witnessed. That every lap counted for something huge. And as it turned out, Bill wins the race. Alan wins the championship, but it came down to 10 points. And those 10 was leading the most laps and leading one lap. And Alan in the car had to count how many laps. His crew was, just beside themselves. I mean, this is very, very intense stuff we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, he won the championship. And unfortunately, we lost Alan in 1993 to a plane crash, lost Davey to a helicopter crash, lost Alan to a plane crash. But just, oh my gosh, it was very, very intense. And trying to write that story was so hard because you couldn't start on it because every lap it changed. It's amazing. It was truly amazing.
You'd probably have to write 3 or 4 endings and then just keep going back and forth. And, I've done that before, and it's miserable. You want to know what's going to happen. And in that case, you couldn't. You try
to start a story, at least have a way to go, some path to take.
Right.
And that race, you couldn't do anything because every time somebody, Bill would lead, Alan would lead, Bill would lead. It was amazing. I mean, I'm telling you, that to me is the most intense NASCAR race of all time.
And if I remember correctly from stories I've read, from things people have told me, the gas man then, they were worried if they got enough fuel in the car on Alan's last pit stop. So everybody's asking him, like, are you sure you had it full enough? Like, are you sure he's got enough to go to the finish? And he's like, I don't know. I hope. I think so. I mean, we'll just have to see. So there was even that added level of stress and uncertainty in the Hooters 7 pit. And it is so tragic that we lost Alan Kulwicki after that. And I think an even sadder part of that is Davey after that race saying, in the next April after we lost Alan, Davey saying, well, I'm glad Alan won the championship because it was the only chance he had, and hopefully I'll have a lot more championships to win mine. Unfortunately, we lost him just a couple months later. I met Alan in 92 at the mall in Gastonia. I promise I'm not going to tell a lot of stories about being in the mall in Gastonia. This is probably the last one. But they did a lot of NASCAR driver autograph sessions then. So but I don't think that my family was there for autograph session. I think we were just there, shopping around, and we were in Belk, and Alan Kulwicki was there. And I don't remember this. I wish I did. But I was like, you're Alan Kulwicki. And he just got a kick out of the fact that I recognized him, and apparently I got his autograph. I don't know what happened to it, but he was. My parents were not really Kulwicki fans at this point, and my mom told me, she's like, we didn't really like him that much. It was kind of all right. And then the interaction I had with him that day, they're like, oh, we were Alan Kulwicki fans after that. So it just shows you how one quick interaction with somebody can truly make a fan forever. And Alan had that effect on so many people. So did Richard Petty and Chase Elliott, Davey, Dale Jr., Bobby, all the people we've talked about in this episode, and many of whom we'll talk about at many lengths in the future. But yeah, just to wrap up, Ben, I mean, that 92 season was truly thrilling. It's the first one I really remember somewhat vividly, and for you and everybody who got to be there and experience it, it had to be truly unlike anything else you've ever seen.
It really was. And the fact that these guys, Alan Kulwicki, Davey Allison, were on the very edge of dominating the 90s is what was going to happen. And they're like, this is sort of a changing of the guard, if you will. And sadly, we didn't get to see that with them. And, we don't have all the answers here. Someday we may, but, we lost 2 great champions. And I call Davey a champion, even though he didn't win one. He came really close. And
definitely
champion as a person, champion as a friend. And just thinking back on that era, that year was just amazing in so many ways. And then, of course, the the last one. What a way to cap off a tremendous season. Even though we had sadness, it was a tremendous race. And it's just, I don't know how to say it better. It's just that race was absolutely the greatest championship race I know of anywhere of any time.
We've reached the point of Richard Petty pulling out on the track to run the last lap of that race of our first episode. I'd like to thank you, Ben, for all these incredible stories. I never heard any of these. It's really exciting for me to kind of relive some of these moments. We look forward to doing this for you as well in future episodes. So for our first episode, I'm Aaron Burns. Ben White, thank you so much for joining me. This has been an absolute pleasure. We'll come back with plenty more episodes in the future of A Lifetime in NASCAR, going over countless stories, moments, drivers, teams, races, tracks, you name it. We're going to talk about it. We'll be back with a new episode very soon. But for now, thanks for listening and so long.